Welcome to our 2021 webinar series. LLIS believes that in 2021, knowledge is key. Each month, you'll learn key insurance solutions to better your insurance knowledge. Our insurance specialists keep up with the constant changes in the insurance industry, especially during a pandemic. Our specialists will review some basics, use case studies to show how LLIS crafted risk management strategies, and answer your insurance-related questions. Each webinar will last about 50 minutes, and you must be logged on for the full 50 minutes to receive CFP credit. Please be sure to ask questions as you have them by typing them into the questions box. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website within a day. Today's guest presenter is an advanced market specialist at Mutual of Omaha. He has been in the industry with Mutual of Omaha for over 20 years. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln in 1992, majoring in political science and philosophy. And he received his JD degree at the University of Nebraska College of Law in 1995. Here to speak on long-term care is Tom Friedrich.
All right. Thank you, Claudia, and thank you everyone for joining today. I always think about putting out my major in my little bio there as political science and philosophy, and I think most people probably think, well, yeah, he was a deep thinker with not much to do with that double major, so he headed to law school, which isn't too far off from the truth. So that put me in line, though, to kind of have a broader career, and it landed me at Mutual of Omaha. And so I am here today to talk to you about the state of Washington's Long-Term Care Trust Act and tell you a little bit more about that, and so that you can understand what is being proposed in what is now law in Washington, and what that might look like in other states then, as we see these types of laws maybe gaining some popularity in other states. And so as you are out there in whatever state you reside in, you might see some of this happening already, but it would help to understand what Washington did, because it is certainly being looked at as a model for what other states can do moving forward. So that is the goal for this presentation today, is to walk through the provisions that Washington implemented and look at a few states that are looking at something as well. We're not going to go into a ton of detail there, but we'll look at what's being proposed, and we'll look at how that affects the industry a little bit. So with that being said, let's get started and take a look at this Washington law. I do have to provide our standard disclaimer, though, that everything I'm going to go through here today is going to be based on our understanding of the laws and regulations. We don't offer specific tax or legal advice. So enough said on that, and let's take a look at this new law. So many of you may know a little bit about this law if you've done any reading on it. It's been fairly popular, but I would also say, and when I say popular, popular in the news in terms of a unique law that's that was passed in Washington, but it's also been a little bit more regionalized in that, a lot of the news that we get in some ways tends to focus on what happens on the East Coast primarily, or generally, and sometimes these West Coast laws and events don't get the coverage that others do, simply because of the time zone difference. But what we're seeing out of Washington is the first of its kind law, and it is some legislation that was designed to address what is seen as shortcomings in today's public health care in terms of providing long-term care coverage for citizens. And so what Washington and what really a lot of states are seeing is a lot of individuals have not taken the appropriate planning steps to cover for long-term care expenses, and as a result, the state is having to pay for long-term care, specifically nursing homes a lot of times, but there is other types of long-term care that the Medicaid program, which is specifically what we're talking about, will pay for, and that is expensive. And so states are spending millions and millions of dollars on this. They realize that it's not going to get any better because we have an aging population, and we need to take some action. And so Washington was the first to take that action. And what they've done is they've levied a payroll tax to create a fund for long-term care benefits. So it's done at the employer level, meaning the employer is the one collecting this tax, similar to other taxes that might be levied against individuals. Some of those are done at the payroll level, and certainly we're most familiar with that with our Social Security taxes. But that's obviously at the federal level. So this is maybe a bit unique in that the state is doing it. And also keep in mind, one of the other reasons why this was a little bit controversial, and it was actually pretty controversial in Washington, is they don't have an income tax. And so there was some debate as to whether or not this was even constitutional according to the state of Washington. But this new payroll tax is set to begin next year, 2022. So it's right around the corner, 3 weeks away, roughly, a little over 3 weeks away. And if you're looking for more information, I've put that website on the screen here. I encourage you to go look at that website. I will tell you, as you can see from the link there, it is a site that's put out and created by the state of Washington. So it is a website that is going to be very pro the benefits of the law. And while there are certainly benefits to it, there's going to be an opposite side to this law where, you know, there are a lot of people that don't see a lot of good coming from it. And we'll talk about what the law provides and some of the shortcomings for sure. But just kind of keep that in mind, is that it's going to be pro the benefits being provided, and not that there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but you're not going to see some of the criticisms that are pointed out about the law on that site. But it is good for general information about what the law provides. So take a look at that if you might be interested in some more information or can't recall something that we go over today. So I think the best place to start is to understand who's subject to the tax. And that's going to be not only residents of Washington, meaning citizens of Washington, but it also includes residents from other states working in Washington. So if I live in Oregon on the border, in a border town, and I go into the state of Washington to work, you do have to be 18 years or older to pay the tax. So if you're a 16-year-old working part-time, you won't pay it. But if you are 18 years or older, you are going to pay that tax, even if you're just working part-time. You don't have to be a full-time employee. And it's levied against W-2 employees. So we specify that because it's an important distinction, as we see on this next slide, because your self-employed individuals are exempt from the payroll tax. And maybe that's because not every self-employed individual pays themselves a wage. Most do. I look at many tax returns for businesses and what I do at Mutual of Omaha, and I would say most self-employed pay themselves a wage, but not everyone does. And so maybe this was just a way around it. I'm not sure what the rationale was for excluding them, but the self-employed individual gets to decide whether or not they want to be subject to this tax and receive this benefit. So they can opt in to the program beginning in January of next year. Note the definition of self-employed. It's sole proprietors, independent contractors, partners, or joint venturers. Now, I don't know specifically what a joint venturer is. That's language directly from the statute. The others are pretty clear to me, but I noted that it didn't include S corporation owners. And so I'm a little fuzzy still on whether or not they are considered self-employed. Typically, I would consider them to be self-employed, but not clear. To the extent they are left out, I would say they are going to be covered by the tax. But I haven't seen any clarification on that either. But note that that is an interesting exemption, I think, overall, just to exclude the self-employed, that they get this option to opt in. But that's certainly, again, been a little bit of a point of contention around this law, is this specific exemption. Who's also not subject to the tax? Well, obviously, if you're retired, you're not paying any wages, so you can't be subject to the tax, which also means you get no benefit. And this has been a point of criticism of the law, in that if I'm, let's say, 65 years old, and I'm retired, maybe I'm not even capable of working anymore, I might be the type of person that really needs this benefit, and I'll never be able to get the benefit because I'm not paying the tax. If you don't pay the tax, you don't get the benefit. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now, the tax is an uncapped tax. It's a 0.58% of wages. So it's not significant, but certainly the more you make, the more you're going to pay, in that it's an uncapped tax. So it's been pointed out that this tax becomes more of a burden on individuals that make more money, right? The more you make, the more you're going to pay. And so from that perspective, again, you have some individuals criticizing the law from that perspective. And when we get a chance to look at the benefit, you'll see the more you make, the more you pay, but you don't really get all that much. So wealthy individuals looking to avoid this tax have a reason to, because they're going to pay more and get less. So you can see the example. If I make $100,000 in Washington, I'm going to pay $580 a year in taxes, and that's not crazy. But again, what am I getting for that $580? We'll see in just a minute. Another criticism has been that for people that don't make a lot of money, another 0.58% charge is something that they can't afford or don't necessarily want to pay, no matter what the benefit is. So they're kind of seeing criticism on this percentage amount on both ends, on the for the individuals that don't make a lot of money and for those that do make a lot of money. The final thought on the 0.58% that you all should be aware of is there's been some research done on whether or not the trust fund that's being created by this payroll tax is going to be sufficient to pay the benefits that are promised. And there's been some studies done by different actuaries that state that this amount is just simply not enough, that it isn't actuarial sound from the beginning, and therefore we need to be looking at modifying this rate already. Otherwise, this is just bad from the beginning. So been a lot of study and debate on this law, and even at the actuarial level. So, but at this point, that 0.58% is where we stand, and that's what it'll be on January 1st. So I told you that if you were retired and you didn't pay the tax, you wouldn't be able to get a benefit, and that's because there's a vesting schedule involved with this tax. You have to pay the tax for a certain amount of time in order to get the benefit. So you must be employed and pay the premium tax for either 10 years without an interruption of 5 or more consecutive years, or pay it for 3 years within the last 6 years. And you have to be working at least 500 hours during each year you've paid that tax. So there's a double requirement there. You've got the yearly requirement, 3 years within the last 6, or 10 years without an interruption of 5 or more consecutive years. But for a year to count, you've got to work 500 hours in that year. So if you're, let's say, 63 years old, you're going to work for the next 2 years and you're done, that's been your plan, and you paid for 2 years, you're not going to get a benefit. If you are within 3 years of retirement and pay it for a full 3 years, and you work that 500 hours a year, then you would vest. And so it depends on the individual as to whether or not they're gonna vest in terms of how many years they have left in working and how much they're working a year. So the vesting schedule might be tricky for individuals that are close to retirement. If you have many years before retirement, certainly you're most likely to vest, but you never know. What if you become disabled? What if you move out of the state for some years and then move back? There's just different things you have to consider that have been, again, levied as criticisms to this law. But keep that in mind, that you can't, it's not just the fact that you pay the tax for 1 year, 2 years, you've got to meet the vesting schedule provided for here on the slide. Now, you also have to be at least 18 years old and not disabled prior to 18 in order to qualify for benefits. And once you have that vesting schedule satisfied, you technically don't get benefits until you need assistance with 3 of 10 activities of daily living. And the activities of daily living are certain things that people have to do on a daily basis in order to take care of themselves. And under most qualified long-term care policies, you have to meet 3 of 5 ADLs, and Washington has upped it to 3 of 10. Now that might sound a little bit better, but we'll look at the ADLs here on this next slide and we'll talk about it some more. But also look at that last point on the bottom of the slide, which is that you have to be a Washington resident at the time of claim. So if I have worked my entire life in the state of Washington and decide to retire, let's say in Hawaii, I've paid the payroll tax for 30 years, worked the 500 hours a year. If I go on claim in the state of Hawaii, I get no benefit. And that's been a big point of contention again, or criticism against the law. So many critics would like to see that changed in some way to allow for individuals to be on claim outside of the state of Washington, but there has not been a change that way. One thing I want to point out real quick, I mentioned on qualified long-term care insurance policies that you had to meet 3 of 5 ADLs. It's actually 2 of 6. I just got that switched around in my head. So let's look at the ADLs that Washington has. I mentioned on the previous slide that there were 10 of them. So you can see in black are the ADLs that you typically see in a long-term care insurance policy: dressing, transfer assistance, bathing, ambulation or mobility, eating, and toileting. Now what Washington added was the 4 others: cognitive impairment, body care, personal hygiene, and medication. So you have to meet 3 of 10 ADLs in the state of Washington to qualify for the benefit. Note that with the standalone qualified long-term care insurance policy, an individual could have a severe cognitive impairment and be considered and qualify for benefits. In the state of Washington, cognitive impairment alone will not get you a benefit. So a little bit more restrictive for Washington. Yes, they've expanded the types of ADLs that you can meet to qualify for a benefit, but you have to meet 3 as opposed to 2, and severe cognitive impairment is not a standalone qualifying event. So for somebody that had that, now they might not be able to do one of these other types of, one of these other ADLs or 2 of these other ADLs, but again, a criticism has been it would be better for most individuals if that stood alone as a qualifying event. So let's say you've vested, you've got 3 of 10 ADLs. What are the benefits exactly that are being provided by the state of Washington? Well, first of all, benefits are available starting January 1st, 2025. And if you think about it, the law becomes effective next month, January 1, 22. You need 3 years of paying the tax to vest. So it makes sense that the first year that benefits are available is January 1st, 2025, 3 years from now. At that time, if you've qualified for benefits, your lifetime benefit is $36,500. That is the maximum benefit available. Now, it may be adjusted for inflation, but as of today, that is the benefit. And that benefit is payable in $100 units. And if you kind of do the math there, you can see that it's essentially paying for a year of benefits. If you do 365 days times $100, there's your $36,500. Of course, you can receive benefits in more than $100 units at a time, but you are going to be capped to the $36,500. So conceivably, you could use that benefit up in a shorter time frame, in less than a year. So it's not a large benefit. It's not meant to be that way, obviously. It's meant to provide some level of care for individuals who need it. And And obviously the fund is designed to be there for individuals that go on claim. So to provide a larger benefit would obviously require a larger tax. So again, once you see this number, the 36,500, you start to think about a wealthy individual making, you know, $1 million or more, or even 500,000 or more in the state of Washington. They're going to be paying quite a bit in taxes for a really, really small benefit, especially if they're younger, say in their 30s or 40s. So it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to pay this tax to get a small benefit. So one of the nice things about the bill for wealthier individuals who are looking at this saying, well, this doesn't make sense for me, is there anything I can do to avoid this tax? Washington did allow an opt-out period. And you're able to opt out of the tax by owning a long-term care insurance policy as of November 1st, 2021. So that deadline has come and gone. So you had to have a policy by November 1st, 2021. If you had that policy issued prior to that date, you had and may still file for an exemption from the payroll tax starting on October 1st, and you can file for an exemption through the end of 2022. You just have to attest with the state that you have a long-term care insurance policy. At this point in time, there is no documentation required when you go and opt out to prove that you have a long-term care insurance policy. The only thing that they've been asking for, according to my understanding of the opt-out, is proof of your identity. That's, you know, so you need a driver's license or passport or something like that. But you don't have to prove anything about having a long-term care insurance policy. You don't have to provide a policy number, don't have to provide a PDF, nothing. Just make an attestation that you have long-term care coverage as defined by the law. So this is done online, like many things today, with the Employment Security Department of the state of Washington. You go online, you file your exemption, they provide you with a letter, and then you provide that to the employer so that your employer does not withhold the payroll tax. And once you opt out as an individual, you can never get back in. And going forward, let's say I'm working for XYZ Corporation, and I've got my opt-out with them. If I switch employers and go to a new one, ABC company, I've got to provide that opt-out letter again. So it's something that has to be done continually to avoid the tax. It's not a one-time thing. It's a one-time opt-out for sure, but it's something you have to continue to communicate to future employers to make sure you're not having a tax levied against you. So you had to have long-term care insurance by November 1st of 2021. We'll talk about that some more in a minute, about what that did to the industry. But the state of Washington was asked that, you know, while people were trying to get their coverage in place, well, what counts as long-term care insurance? And the new law actually didn't provide a separate definition for long-term care insurance. They simply referred back to the Washington statutes that were in existence that defined long-term care insurance. So what we were able to determine in order to qualify for the exemption by purchasing a long-term care insurance policy is that it meant really three different things. It meant a standalone qualified long-term care insurance policy that I think many of you are familiar with. And so that was pretty clear. We knew that was going to be the case. But it also included a long-term care rider attached to a life insurance policy or an annuity. And it would also include group life policies, group annuity policies, or riders attached to such policies that provide directly or supplement long-term care insurance. So I haven't seen too many people talk about that third bullet point. Certainly here at Mutual of Omaha, I can tell you that we have a standalone qualified long-term care insurance policy, and we had a life insurance policy with a long-term care rider. Another product that was in question that we had to look at a little bit more closely, and I think other carriers had to look at more closely as well, was the life insurance policy with a chronic illness rider, because we have that as well, as do other carriers. And after looking at the state statute that's referenced there and applying it to our rider, our chronic illness rider, we were able to determine that we did not think that specific rider qualified under this definition. So if you see something like this come up again, where an exemption is provided for long-term care insurance that's in existence, you do need to make sure that what the client has meets the definition. And really the best way to do that is to reach out to your carrier to make sure it would fall under that exemption definition. That way your client feels good about what they have. They can file for the exemption in good faith and not have to pay the tax. Again, that would assume a state adopts something similar. And I do think states are going to look at this as a model for what they might do. And I think an exemption makes sense to the extent you can make sure people are getting a good policy and give people enough time to get that policy. Because what we saw happening in Washington was a last minute rush to get these policies. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute. What was interesting about the state of Washington requirement for long-term care insurance is that there was no minimum benefit required. And that was a big concern for the industry. We were seeing a lot of business coming through, not just Mutual, but other carriers. And we could tell from the policies being applied for and issued that there wasn't a lot of planning being done. These were, for many, just your bare bone policies, whether it was a life policy with long-term care rider or a standalone long-term care insurance policy. And so there was a lot of concern, there is a lot of concern that these policies aren't going to last, that people got these policies to apply for the exemption and they have no intention of keeping them for the long term. And that's not good business for carriers, it's not good business for producers, and it's not good business or good planning for the client. Because let's be honest, we can act like long-term care coverage is something that, well, I guess what I wanted to say is this is not really a political issue. The Washington state law has become political like so many things in our society today, but whether you or I ever need long-term care coverage or long-term care services is a wild card. I'm fairly healthy, but who knows where my health goes in the future. A lot of it is related, in my mind, to our DNA, and some of it is just pure luck. I've got two parents that are older, both 80 years old. My mom has survived breast cancer twice. Post age 65, my dad survived a stroke, and neither one of them needs full-time care or any sort of long-term care services at age 80. I consider that lucky, and I'm not sure if they do, given what they've gone through. But at the same time, that is something that affects everyone, or potentially affects everyone. So we definitely need to get the word out about long-term care insurance and making sure clients don't just get a minimum policy to avoid a law is not good planning. And I think that's the message that I wanted to say there, is that that's really what we'd like to see as an industry, is that people do the right planning. And I know as planners, you all think the same as well. And so we need to do that planning that makes sense for our client, and not just, hey, what can I do to avoid this law? And I mentioned this earlier, the other thing that was not real popular with carriers was you're going to grant this exception, this exclusion to the premium tax for people that have a policy, but you're not making them provide any proof that they have coverage. And that just didn't make sense to the industry. It's a continuing criticism of the law because of what kind of business we've seen that I explained just a second ago. We know there's policies out there that aren't designed to last. So what you have is a lot of people avoiding the payroll tax. And so what is that going to do to the fund? If you had people that got out of it and probably may need care down the road, but aren't going to have this minimal coverage, which isn't much anyways, but you kind of didn't do much for those individuals anyways. They obviously work the system very well. So I've kind of touched on this a little bit. When does it make sense to opt out of a tax like this? And this would be individuals and families who have the money to buy a better policy. It doesn't make sense to pay this voluntary tax, which is really what it is, when you could get a better policy by paying for it out of pocket. Your younger individuals could pay this tax for years and years and years and have a very small benefit. If you're 1 year out from retirement, you probably want to opt out because you'll never vest. If you're 2 years out, you may not as well. You may not either. What if you're 5 years out and you're worried about your health and meeting that 500-hour requirement? So, you know, there are people that might be close to retirement where getting a private policy makes sense to the extent they can. Even if it's not a policy that would get them out of paying the tax, they should look at something to replace the benefit that they may never get, or to provide a little bit more protection. And there are options out there for that as well. If you're not going to be in Washington, if you know you're retiring in another state, why would you want to pay this tax? Even if you wanted the flexibility of moving out of Washington, why would you want to pay this tax? Because it's not going to be there for you. And then finally, hey, if you just want more benefit and more flexibility, then a standalone policy or a life with long-term care rider is probably going to give you a better benefit. It'll definitely give you more. So there's lots of reasons to look at something outside of the state-provided benefit. So on the flip side, who might want the benefit? Well, lower income individuals closer to retirement who know they're going to vest might want this product. And what lower income means, I guess, is maybe a little bit relative. But if you're making 30, 40, 50, 60,000, and maybe other than not making a ton of money in your lifetime, maybe you've managed your money okay, but didn't buy a policy like this, you know, that, let's say you're making 50K, that $250 a year, if you're going to pay it for 5 years, you know, it's not a bad deal. It's not a huge benefit, but you also didn't pay that much for it. So that might make some sense. So, you know, I think there are going to be people out there where it makes sense, but it's not a huge swath of the population where it does. But at the same time, if you do qualify for it and you need care, it's going to be better than nothing. It's going to provide some level of care that you maybe would have had to spend down to get to Medicaid before you got anything that wasn't out of pocket. So I've kind of touched on this already, and I said we would talk about it. What did the Washington law do to the long-term care market? And I think it's kind of interesting to take a look at it, because one of the things to think about, at least from your perspective as advisors, is, well, if something like this does come to my state, what would happen? And we can look at Washington to get an understanding of what might happen. And keep in mind, Washington is a good-sized state geographically, but you know, population-wise, it's not huge. So if it came to a larger state, and we'll look at what states are considering it, I think the effect could be even worse. But what I have here is some carrier changes that occurred in the state of Washington due to the Washington state law. And you can see the lion head on there, that's Mutual of Omaha. I'm going to focus on what we did as a carrier just because I'm more familiar with that. So this law passed late 2020, I believe, when action really started taking on it. You know, the law passed in 2020, I believe, and then we really started seeing a lot of action around it, publicity, people, you know, buying policies in that late 2020, really even more into early 21 of this year. And so beginning in May, we started changing some of our commission schedules and some of our underwriting requirements related to long-term care policies. Parameds were no longer allowed, and I know some of you may not know that, we needed a doctor's visit to satisfy some of our underwriting requirements. In June, we increased the minimum issue age on our policy to 40. So think about that. If you were 30 and wanting to opt out, you couldn't, because you couldn't get our policy. Now, you may have been able to get another carrier's policy for a little bit of time, but I know other carriers started increasing their minimum age. We also required a minimum benefit. And then only a week later, we suspended all our long-term care insurance sales in Washington. And that's our standalone product. So we were still selling our life with long-term care rider as of this time in middle of June. In July, towards the end of July, though, we increased the minimum face amount to $250,000 on our life policy. And then again, about a month later, we had to suspend our sales of our life with long-term care rider in the state of Washington, with still a good 2.5 months left before people had that 11/1 deadline to get their long-term care insurance policy. So the reasoning for the opt-out, or I guess for us suspending sales, was quite honestly, it was just volume and bad business. We were getting so many life insurance policies, so many long-term care insurance policies that we couldn't keep up with the volume. And it wasn't good business, not only in the state of Washington from that perspective of being able to keep up, but for other states as well. It was overwhelming our underwriting team for both life and long-term care, and it was affecting policies in other states. So we just couldn't keep up with the volume, which many of you might think, well, that's a good thing, you're making sales, but you want to do a good job of underwriting and issuing these policies, and it just wasn't happening. The other thing was, as I mentioned, we had concerns over lapsing and canceling of policies. And, we lose about $700 on each application, even if we charge it back when you consider our underwriting costs. And so again, that's not good business to us. So even though we were seeing a lot of sales, if you're going to charge a lot back, what good is that business? And that's what other carriers were seeing. You can see the other carriers suspending sales at various points of time in 2021. And again, you would probably see that occur with other states if they implemented something similar with such a short time frame. Because what ended up happening is not everybody knew about the law. Even though it was pretty public in Washington, you have people that don't pay attention closely, or don't read the news at all, or maybe don't care, are just kind of those procrastinator types. So we just saw a lot of activity, the industry did, and we just had to pull out of the state. Now, we started selling long-term care insurance again on December 1st in the state of Washington, so 6 days ago, and I assume other carriers are getting back in the market as well. So it was a temporary thing, was never meant to be something permanent, but just a result of what we were seeing in the market. So other states are considering similar legislation, so let's look at those and see what we've got here. We've got about 11 states here that have started looking at legislation at one form or another, and most if not all are in the very early stages of looking at this legislation. The ones that get mentioned the most, though, I will tell you, is California, Illinois, and Minnesota and New York. Those four, if you just Google an article about states considering something, are the ones that are commonly mentioned as looking at something similar to what Washington did. And so if you're in one of those states, just kind of keep that in mind. It might be something you want to follow as an advisor to make sure you're prepared to help your clients with some sort of planning if these laws ever take place. Now, the state that's gone the farthest, at least my understanding, is the state of California, a huge state, right, in terms of geography and population. So again, just kind of think about what might happen if California were to adopt a law similar to Washington. It would be very overwhelming if they had a very short time frame for opt-out, if they provided one at all. I think they would. But as an industry, I can tell you we would like a longer opt-out, simply to allow for better planning and better underwriting and better support of our advisors and clients from A to Z. So what California has, though, is they have a task force, and this task force has to put forth a recommendation on what their program might entail and a feasibility of those options to the governor and the legislator by the end of 2023. So 2 years away from a recommendation. Now, that doesn't mean work isn't being done, because I've spoken to one of our sales partners out in California, and he's working, he's very much involved in these discussions. And so work is being done, and the industry is involved at a state level. We work through the American Council of Life Insurers to work with our state insurance departments to provide input on these types of laws. And so you can rest assured we are working to make sure the state hears what we think are good ideas related to any state laws like this. But they're not looking at having anything recommended for another 2 years. So while that doesn't mean you have time to just kind of sit on your hands, it does mean that there is some time to do the right planning. And I think that's the message to your clients is, look, other states, our state might be looking at doing something similar to Washington. And, you know, I would advise you to let's look at doing our own planning around long-term care so you're protected and you don't have to worry about these laws. There's also some federal legislation, and I think it's interesting to look at different pieces of legislation, but not look at, you know, 10 or 11 or however many there are, just because it takes so long for these to get passed, and they get modified, and you lose track of them. They might sit for 2 years. So I picked out just one, and this is called the WISH Act. It was introduced this year by Representative Tom Suozzi out of New York, and it's really pretty similar to Social Security in that it's a payroll tax, which our Social Security benefit is paid for through a payroll tax, half by the employer, half by the employee, similar again to Social Security. You get full benefits after 40 quarters of coverage. Sound familiar? A lot like Social Security. You get your benefits at Social Security full retirement age, and your benefit is based on your working history. So it really is something, as I just said, very similar to Social Security, but it would provide a fund for long-term care coverage. And I think what the representative was thinking quite possibly was, well, what has worked for our seniors over the past, 70, 80, 90 years since it was implemented? And Social Security, maybe we've all gotten used to it. Some still don't like it. Others, it's just part of what we do now as a country. But at least on some level, you can make an argument that people have an income in retirement, and that's their Social Security benefit. So maybe this is, what he was thinking when he proposed this type of plan and put it into formal legislation. It hasn't really moved much. It's not anything that's going to be implemented soon. So I don't think this is something you should necessarily watch for anytime soon. But it gives you an idea of what the federal, what's being proposed at the federal level. And there's some other proposals as well that are out there. So just kind of keep that in mind. But the lack of action at the federal level is clearly what caused Washington to take action, is the fact that, well, if Washington, the federal government's not going to do something, we need to do something. And so to the extent we continue to see the lack of federal action, a lack of legislation that's final and approved and signed by the president, you will see and continue to see more pressure at the state level to do something. So what does this mean for long-term care insurance? You have proposals at the federal level, at the state level. What are we doing as an industry? What does it mean for you as advisors as you talk to your clients about planning around long-term care? Well, like I mentioned before, carriers, whether it's us or any of the other carriers, we work together with the American Council on Life Insurance to lobby and work side by side with state governments and state insurance departments to come up with legislation that's beneficial to policyholders and residents of every state. So we are lobbying, we are working with them to make sure any legislation is something that we think is good policy, not only for us as carriers, but ideally for citizens as well. So we're going to try and continue those lobbying efforts. And even in Washington, a lot of that work is still going on because there is a lot of pressure, specifically in Washington. We're very concerned about the risk of lost tax revenue due to the exemption. I mentioned that earlier, people getting exempted, and we feel like they're going to let those policies lapse. And that's bad policy for the state of Washington. We also would like to see more around a section of the Washington law that is specifically required the state of Washington to promote the development of products that support the program. And so we would like to work more with the state of Washington to see a better partnership around our products that would support their program. And so we're working on that. And I would give you a quick update on a couple things related to the state of Washington, since I've got this slide here. A couple things to note. Realize, I know I mentioned this, that if you work, for example, in the state of Idaho, or if you live in the state of Idaho but work in Washington, you're subject to the payroll tax but may never get a benefit. So that the Attorney General for the state of Idaho asked for the state of Washington to exempt Idaho residents from the law, from the payroll tax. And if he didn't, he was going to file a lawsuit to resolve the matter. And that was on November 8th. He gave him a November 22nd deadline. Now, I don't know if he's filed that lawsuit, but it has trickled up to the AGs of states surrounding the state of Washington because they estimate about 150,000 people work in Washington but don't actually live there. So that's a lot of people that are affected by this that'll never get a benefit from it. Also, the Seattle Times reported last week that the governor of Washington and Democrats are looking to delay the enactment of the tax by at least a year. So that's something that the Democrats are looking to do, but the governor has noted that he doesn't have the power alone to do that. He would need to call a special session in order to get that done. So there's a lot still going on and at the 12th hour here to see if some changes can be made. We'll see what happens. So some things that we'd like to do as carriers, we would, like I said, like to align the benefits maybe in our policies to start after a state or federal program's benefits are exhausted. Maybe our policies need to become more catastrophic in nature, again, where we kind of take over after benefits are exhausted, or even aligning our elimination periods in our long-term care policies to fit when state law kicks in, or I should say has ended. So those are some things we're working on specifically, and we hope, to get some better alignment with these state laws as they come out, rather than what happened with the state of Washington. So as advisors, what's your messaging? What are your talking points with clients about long-term care in relation to these new laws? And I guess what I would tell you is, you've got states and the federal government that are looking at it, but you don't want to wait for them to take action in order for you to, as a client, as an individual, to take action. You don't know if that law is going to be a good law or a bad law related to your own situation. So control what you can control, and let's do the planning that makes sense for you and your family. Because an opt-out's only going to be creating a rush. The longer you wait, all the products increase in price. And at least what we saw in Washington that I didn't point out, if you've got a non-working spouse, they're not going to get a benefit. So if you're working with clients that have somebody like that, there's a decent chance that the state of Washington, a law similar to the state of Washington isn't going to cover them either. So you want to make sure your family's protected. You might end up paying a tax without much of a benefit. And as always, you guys are planners. now's the time to create the right plan for you, not just something that's going to avoid a payroll tax. So with long-term care insurance, you get a personalized plan versus the one size fits all. That could mean in deciding what's the right benefit amount, what's the right elimination period. Some carriers like Mutual provide a care coordinator. If that's important to you, you can find a carrier like that. Is inflation protection provided? With the Washington benefit, it might be increased, but you don't know. With the standalone policy, you could choose that protection. There might be a cash benefit available. You can, if you're married, you can get spousal protection, and that can lead to a greater benefit at a cheaper price, or at least a more efficient price. And there are even some discounts available. So those are all great reasons to think about doing a private policy, whether it's a standalone policy or life with long-term care rider. It's going to be portable. You can use funds from other life products or annuity products, maybe as a source of funding. And certainly the higher wage earners have a reason to look, because they'll get a better benefit for what they're paying for. And certain states have tax credits and deductions available that make it a little bit more affordable overall. And then finally, I mentioned this earlier, the severe cognitive impairment is important. That alone by itself will get a client to qualify for benefits. You might have a better choice of care providers than what would be offered through the state. And that's, of course, going to be important. And I'm going to mention the care coordinator again. If you decide that that's important to your client, that need a one-time death payment claim. That can be time consuming. You need a death certificate, you need to file the forms with the insurance carrier, but it's pretty straightforward, and you get the payment and you're done. With a long-term care insurance policy, you might be getting benefits for years, and the care coordinator can help make sure that your client gets the most out of that policy. So I think that's a great benefit that I know we provide along with our long-term care insurance policy. And so I think that really is something to look at, because you might have somebody that qualifies for benefits, have a severe cognitive impairment. They can't make decisions for themselves. So maybe a husband or a wife is helping their loved one through this process. Meanwhile, they're stressed out with the health issues. Having a care coordinator is invaluable at that time to help make sure they get the most out of their policy. So that's enough on that, but I do love that provision. And then finally, working with a carrier that knows the business, knows the industry, that's very important. With a state benefit, you're not going to get that. You're all on your own, and you don't have much to begin with. So private long-term care insurance, whether it's a life policy or a standalone, is going to provide better benefits to your clients. And I think that's the messaging you should provide. So that's what I have. I hope I went over everything in a way that gave you a good feel for the state of Washington and where things are headed, and why your clients should look at doing the right planning with some sort of coverage. And with that being said, I'll turn it back over to Claudia here and see if we have any other questions or any questions.
We do. We have a couple of questions coming in, and anyone who has any other questions, please be sure to put them in the questions box.
Okay. I do see the first one. What might be the next first state to follow Washington? And I really think at this point in time, California would be the first one. I think they're the furthest along. That doesn't mean they'd be the first to finish, but it's a Democratic state, and I think that matters, because what we saw in Washington was Democrats were for the law, Republicans were against it, and we're still seeing that. So I think you'd see, given where they're at and given generally viewed as a Democratic state, them taking the most, getting there first. Next question is, are 10 pays and single pay policy a thing of the past? I can tell you at Mutual of Omaha, the 10 pay or the single pay on a long-term care insurance policy, a standalone one, is a thing of the past. We do not offer that option any longer. I can't speak for other carriers. I don't know, Claudia, if you can speak to that. Do you know?
We do have one that says NGL has a 10 pay.
Okay. So one carrier at least still doing it. All right, next question. If states have a one-time opt-out like Washington and then never check again, do you think some companies might stop offering coverage in that state sooner than later? If states have a one-time opt-out like Washington, oh, and then it repeated for some reason. So if a state has a one-time opt-out and never check to make sure that they really have a policy, might carriers pull out sooner rather than later? I think if we see that again, I definitely think we would likely pull out sooner rather than later. Now, you obviously can't hold me to that. I'm not one of those decision makers in my company, but it certainly makes sense that why would we wait for this bad business? We've seen this movie already. Let's just take our popcorn and leave. Are you able to opt out without having long-term care insurance? That's the question. In the state of Washington, you are not. You must have long-term care insurance as of November 1st, 2021 in order to opt out. The problem has been for us as an insurance industry, and really what will be a problem for the state of Washington is they, up until this point in time, have not asked for citizens who are opting out to provide any sort of proof that they actually have coverage. Next question. We know long-term care companies got inundated with applications to Washington and had to shut off the applications well before the November 1st date. How might the companies try to manage that going forward? And I think the best way we can manage that is by working with states prior to legislation being formally enacted, because in my mind, what I would like to see, and I don't know how this would work actuarially, but in my mind, I would like to see either one, a longer opt-out of say 2 or 3 years to allow individuals to do the right type of planning, or two, an ongoing opt-out. I'm not sure why the state wouldn't want people opting out if they have a long-term care insurance policy with minimum requirements, because they wouldn't need that revenue. If I paid into the system for 10 years and finally said to myself, Tom, you've been paying this tax for 10 years and the benefit stinks, why not get your own policy? Isn't that better that you got 10 years of premium from me and now I'm never going to qualify for the benefit because I opt out? I still think that's a benefit to the fund. So, but I know there may be something that I'm not thinking of there. So I think that's the best thing that we can do, is to work with the states to get a law that fits better with people being able to get coverage for a longer period of time and then opt out. Okay, I am not seeing any other questions come through. How about you, Claudia?
Nope, I think that's it. It's been pretty silent on our end. So, but thank you very much, Tom. It's a very informative webinar, and yeah, it's something that we still are keeping our eye on, as other states are looking into what the Washington model was. Everyone, I do have one more question.
Okay.
It says, do you have to provide your employer with a certificate of coverage? Do you know,
what
Tom?
you provide? Yeah, what you provide the employer with is, it's called an exemption letter from the state of Washington. So without that letter from the state, the employer is going to make sure that tax is levied against you. And you get that exemption letter from the state. You have to go online. There's a website you go to, and you just fill out the form basically requesting the exemption. That process, though, where you're online requesting the exemption, that's where there's no proof of insurance required. But once you go back to your employer and say, hey, I know this law starts on January 1, I should be exempt. Here's my letter of exemption. And that's the way you get out of the payroll tax.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's it for questions. And once we end this webinar, our viewers are able to type in some questions that they might have, and we will definitely forward that over to Tom. Again, thank you so much, Tom, and thank you for everyone for tuning in. We do have one more webinar next Tuesday, uh, and this again uh, this webinar was being recorded, so if anyone needs to catch up on it, we'll have that posted on our website. And thank you again, Tom. We're so glad that you were
Absolutely.
able to join us.
Yeah, glad to help. Glad to be here. And thanks everyone for joining the call. I hope you got good information out of it. And it's definitely, like you said, Claudia, something that we should continue to watch and see what states take action next.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for tuning in, everyone. I will close off this webinar. Thanks again. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.